I am so excited to introduce this podcast to you between Lisa Hendrickson-Jack and myself on the fifth vital sign, which is your menstrual cycle. So we talk all about what this fifth vital sign means, why it's so important, how to track it, what a good one looks like. But then we also get into contraception. How long should you be off it before you're trying to conceive? And we talk about her new book coming out, which is Real Food for Fertility. I am so excited for this. You're going to learn so much. I learned so much, and you are going to be as usual, I hope, inspired and moving forward so much smarter on your fertility journey than I did. Okay, so now for the formal introduction. Lisa Hendrickson-Jack is a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner who teaches women to chart their menstrual cycles for natural birth control, conception, and monitoring overall health. And remember, fertility is a byproduct of overall health and wellness. In her best-selling book, The Fifth Vital Sign, Lisa debunks the myth that regular ovulation is only important when you want children by recognizing the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. She hosts the Fertility Friday Podcast, a weekly radio show devoted to helping women connect to their fifth vital sign by uncovering the connection between menstrual cycle, fertility, and overall health. Please welcome Lisa. Hi, Lisa. I'm so excited that you're here talking to us about the fifth vital sign. I preach all the time. Fertility is a byproduct of overall health and wellness. And I think from your genius, you are sharing how really one of the ultimate signs of health and wellness is your menstrual cycle. So before we get started, why don't you just share a little bit about how you got into this work and how you kind of discovered this link between your menstrual cycle and overall health, wellness, and therefore, of course, fertility.
I think like a lot of people, I had my own challenges with my menstrual cycle when I was young. So my very first period was painful, it was very heavy. And so I had a very interesting entrance into it. And I have had a lot of time to think about this. So I realized I didn't really hate my periods. They weren't great, but I did have a sense that they probably shouldn't be that way because everyone I knew didn't have the same experience. So I, like many young ladies, was put on the pill at a very young age. I think I was about 15. And I used it for a little bit.
Due to your period, because they were just so, you obviously had endometriosis. And
I probably do.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was so easy. I basically said 3 words and the doctor was already writing the script, right? And so I go on this pill.
Like flashing red flags to you at all?
Or I was a child. That was the goal. Like my goal was to get, because girls talk, right? So like my goal was to go in and get on the pill because I heard that it made the periods easier. So I was like, well, I want that.
Okay.
And so I got the script and the thing is that I wasn't using it for birth control because I wasn't sexually active. And so, I'm like a kid. I'm like, I'm right. This is great. So I would come off the pill every now and then because I was fixed and then the periods would come back just as heavy. So I didn't have language to describe what was going on. But I feel like that really did set me up for what's happening now. So fast forward a few years, I discovered fertility awareness in my first year of university. And I thought it was great because I had never taken the pill for birth control. So I had read the thing and it said, if you miss it or if you don't take it at the same time, you got to take it again. So I actually was really nervous about being on this thing for birth control. So I decided to do the opposite thing. And when I needed birth control, I came off the pill. And I was just going to use condoms. And that's when I found fertility awareness. And so, it was an interesting journey because I still had to deal with the painful periods. I just decided to use some Advil and try to figure things out. I started charting and discovered I could avoid pregnancy with, this wonderful method that was non-hormonal to the same degree of efficacy. So that was fantastic. But then when I started charting, I saw that my cycles were super long. And I thought it was great at first because I remember reading Taking Charge of Your Fertility and she's like, well, some people have long cycles and some people have short cycles. I was like, oh, I'm Lisa. I have long cycles. Like I'm just unique. I'm an individual, right? So I had a charting instructor inform me that was not normal and that my temperatures were too low. And then it was identified that I had a subclinical thyroid issue. And for me, that blew my mind, obviously, because someone could just look at my chart and see that I had thyroid issue. I mean, that was crazy.
Wow.
So this was really my introduction to this concept that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign. And it's kind of through those humble beginnings that I ended up eventually starting the podcast and writing the book to inform the kind of answer to like, every woman should know this stuff. Like, okay, here's the book, right? Because that's it's such a rabbit hole. There's so much information there. But really and truly, that personal experience led me to understand how closely our menstrual cycles are tied to our health. And it's really led to this whole work and business and all the things that are happening now, because really the goal and the mission is to inform women so that we know, so that we can have a much better understanding of what's going on in our bodies, and so that we can also be empowered to do something if our cycles aren't optimal.
You went through this journey and just so I'm clear, when did you start that charting and going through that journey? How old were you?
I was pretty young. I was about 18, 19.
Okay. And what I just find fascinating is that probably wasn't discussed with your pediatrician, OBGYN, anyone like that.
Oh no, I'm not the type to go ask my doctor permission to chart my cycles. I'm just the type to like come off the pill and just do my thing.
Right. But it's just not, my point is it's just not, it's not something people know because it's not talked about.
Yeah.
Right. And this is where I'm always saying to people, get obsessed with the why. Why are you having these conditions? Why do you have a short cycle, a long cycle? Why do you have cramps, back pain, clots? Get obsessed with the why, because our brilliant doctors are just going to fix the what, right? Like with you. Oh, you have really heavy periods. Here's the pill.
Yeah.
I want us to get obsessed with the why, even when maybe a doctor that hasn't been trained on it is like, it's fine. You could still get pregnant. You just need to do this. Oh, you haven't gotten your period? Take progesterone. Oh, that's
how they're trained, right?
Right.
I mean, it's one of those things where you learn all this really interesting stuff about the menstrual cycle. If you learn that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign and learn that you can chart your cycles and learn so much information about your body, you want to kind of take it to I've had so many clients, they start charting and they go and they take their charts to their doctor and they expect the doctor to say something informative, but we can't really expect that. It's like going to McDonald's and expecting them to change your tires and getting super mad at them that they're not going to like check your oil and stuff. You're just like, but we do burgers here. So like, if you understand how they're trained, I feel like we can put down our pitchforks, because we still often need our doctors for assistance, for testing, for a lot of things. We need to be clear on the fact that this is literally how they're trained to deal with menstrual cycle issues.
Right. 100%. That's why I say don't blame your brilliant doctor for focusing on the what, because that's their specialty. That's what they are trained in, especially the more specialized that they are. Yeah, I share all the time my friend who was a OBGYN, and she was like, we learned about nutrition and supplements or anything, like any kind of functional medicine was 20 minutes in all of my training, in all of my 8 years, plus all this training. And so it's okay. Yes. And so as a patient, get obsessed with the why. Okay. So I feel like I've covered this, but just I would love for you to cover this as well. But what does a normal, healthy menstrual cycle look like?
Absolutely. It's interesting because sometimes when I get that question, the focus is just on the period. And so a lot of people will kind of talk about the menstrual cycle as if it's the period. So I think the first step to answering that question is, when I talk about the menstrual cycle, I'm talking about the whole thing. So, starting on that first day of your true flow and then ending the day before your next one. So in terms of that, we can go through some of the parameters. A healthy period, lasts anywhere from 3 to 7 days. 5 is average. And a period should be like a sentence. It should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then be done. And so that's something to consider in terms of the flow pattern, usually starting moderate to heavy and then kind of tapering off after the first few days. The color should be a variant of red. It shouldn't be too dark or black, or, the clotting should be minimal. If any, ideally there would be no clotting. And then in terms of, volume, I know I'm focusing on the period, so just let me go through that for a minute here. But, in terms of the volume of the period, I think it is really interesting because I do feel that most women understand that there's too heavy, but I think because periods are so looked at so negatively, often if the period is light, we might think that that's great, even if it's too light. So generally, I'm in Canada, so, I often will kind of give that range, 25 to 80 milliliters, 1 to 3 ounces or so, because if you really are bleeding too little, that could be a problem as well. And I think something to consider is, though pain is really, really common, we shouldn't consider it to be optimal. I mean, there's few situations. The only situation I can come up with where we think of pain as normal is childbirth. So outside of childbirth, imagine if your favorite male friend had pain so severe that he had to take Advil, a couple days every single month in his penis, right? So although it's very common to experience pain, I would say moderate to severe pain that requires pain medication, again, common, we should be looking at that and saying, your lovely question of like, well, what's going on? Like, why are we having this, right? So once we move past the period, in that pre-ovulatory phase.
Sorry, I just have one question. When you say 1 to 3 ounces or whatever it was in millimeters or milliliters, how often? Every day? Do you know what I mean?
The whole time.
The whole time?
Yeah.
Yeah. So per day, 1 to 3 ounces per day.
Yeah. I mean, in my classes, I often do a visual because it's kind of hard to picture this. Mm-hmm. And so I'll use the menstrual cup as a visual for, demonstrative purposes.
Okay.
And a menstrual cup holds about an ounce or so. And so I think it's not exact. You'd have to actually do the conversion. Maybe it's up to 4 ounces or something like that. But generally speaking, if I take 80 milliliters, and put it in a menstrual cup and put it and pour it out until it's done, I can fill the menstrual cup something like 3 to 4 times.
Okay.
And so that gives you a visual. And what's interesting about this range is that there's obviously women who bleed more than that. So when you look in the literature, they usually cap what they consider to be the maximum amount of flow at about 80 milliliters. I have seen studies that cap it at 60 milliliters. And the reason they do that is because when you're bleeding that much, you're much more likely to be deficient in iron or, those kinds of things. So it's kind of that point at which we should just check to see if everything's good and maybe monitor iron levels or things like that. But when you look at studies that look at how much women bleed, I mean, lots of women bleed way more than that. So there are obviously women who bleed that much in one day. And when you look at the numbers, it's like there was one study that was like 5 milliliters to 180 milliliters was the overall range in the study. And I've seen some where it goes up to like 600 or even more, And so there's definitely a wide range, but then what would we consider normal? And so I think that it is really helpful to have that. Like there is a top. Now, menstrual cups are a little bit different. Not everyone uses menstrual cups. So, the equivalent to a menstrual cup could be something like 3 to 4 regular tampons soaked. Mm-hmm. And it's all a range. How much blood fits into one tampon? Maybe 5 to 10 milliliters. It kind of depends on the size of the tampon. So it's not a perfect science. But the point is to get that conversation going. If you are using tampons, let's say, and in the first day, you have to change it every hour, that's too much, right? That means it's too heavy. Even if you have to change it every 2 hours, that's a lot. Mm-hmm. And then if you're using a menstrual cup, if you're changing it 6 times a day, that's too much. On the flip side, if you have your entire period and you don't even fill the cup once, if you add it all together, that's too light.
Got it. Okay, so that was the period part, and I had to just get clarification. So then what's next?
Well, so once the period ends, then we move into that pre-ovulatory phase. And so from that fertility awareness lens, we're starting to look for cervical fluid. So in a normal healthy cycle, we would expect to see a few dry days, we call them. So those are just the days before you start to actually see that fluid. Cervical fluid can look like clear, stretchy, raw egg whites. It can look like creamy white hand lotion. And so we tend to have a few days before we start to see it. And then when we start to see that cervical fluid, we would expect anywhere from 2 to 7 days of that cervical fluid, whether it's the creamy, lotiony type or the clear, kind of raw egg white type, until we hit ovulation. And then once you ovulate, we would expect for that cervical fluid to dry up, to eventually stop, and then to have a post-ovulatory phase. So the number of days between ovulation and your next period, we would expect it to be about 12 to 14 days. And then the overall length of the cycle, anywhere from about 24 to 35 days, is considered normal with an average of about 29 days. I mean, so all of that is to say that when you think of your menstrual cycle as a vital sign, and we kind of break it down into those different aspects, there's a lot of opportunities within to see different pieces of it. So for example, like you said, if someone has really significant pain, that could be a sign that they might have endometriosis, especially if they're having pain outside of their period or pain with sex or, other situations. If they're having bleeding throughout the cycle, let's say, because I mentioned the period part, so we shouldn't have bleeding all the time, that could indicate something like polyps or fibroids, or there's a whole list of things that could indicate. If you have cervical fluid all the time, if you're noticing discharge, every single day, that could be a sign of, something as simple as a yeast infection or BV or something like that. And, there are abnormal discharge, that's associated with cervical dysplasia. So I've had a number of clients who have like this wet, watery discharge all the time where they go to the bathroom and they're wiping and they're seeing this wet stuff kind of consistently throughout the cycle. It's not mucus. And so I've had a number of clients identify abnormal cervical cells from, an observation like that. And so, I could go on, but the point I'm making is that there's a lot of different things we can identify just in a very practical way from tracking the cycle. And it could be something as simple as a yeast infection all the way up to potentially something cancerous or something serious. And so at the most basic level, when you learn this stuff, it's like, well, of course we should be monitoring this. This is really important. And, how simple is it in a way to be able to identify all of this important information just by tracking what's happening in our cycles?
Yes. And so it's I'm so grateful that you're teaching us this, what to look for and then what's normal. There's always a range, but if it seems a little extreme or off, it's something to definitely look into. So, and I just had one question I wrote down, if you don't mind. Just when you say it could either be like a creamy lotion or a clear fluid, is one better than what does that mean if it's a creamy lotion versus a clear fluid?
I mean, basically what it means is that there's two general types of mucus, at least in the method that I teach. We teach about non-peak mucus and peak mucus. So for example, when you are in that fertile window, let's say your period, or when you're approaching the fertile window, your period has just ended. The reason that you're seeing this cervical fluid is because as those follicles are developing in preparation for ovulation, they're releasing estrogen. And that estrogen is actually triggering your cervix to produce cervical mucus. And so what can happen is toward the beginning of that phase, let's say, as the estrogen is rising, that mucus production is just starting to happen. And so you might have that cervical mucus mixing in with a little bit of vaginal cells or different things to give that kind of creamier look to it, I suppose you could say. And on the flip side, when the estrogen is really flowing and it's a lot higher, that's when we tend to produce more of the clear, kind of stretchy type of cervical fluid. And what's interesting is that if you are, let's say, trying to conceive, so you're trying to get pregnant, we don't want to consider these two different types of mucus in that pre-ovulatory phase to be more or less fertile, because you can't be more or less pregnant. You can just be pregnant or not. And so when I'm teaching about these different types of mucus, I mean, although they are a bit different and they do have different qualities, and I go like into the weeds about those qualities in the fifth vital sign in the third chapter, I kind of go into a lot more detail in there if someone really wants to nerd out on that. So there are different qualities that they have, but a person can get pregnant because when you have that type of cervical fluid, it means two important things. So one, the mucus itself can keep the sperm alive for up to 5 days, and you can't predict ovulation necessarily ahead of time. So your body is naturally making that mucus on purpose at the right time so that when you ovulate, the sperm is already there. So that's the first thing. And then, the second piece of it is that as you get closer to that higher estrogen level, because ultimately it's the high estrogen that triggers ovulation. So your estrogen levels are highest those couple of days before you ovulate, and that could correspond with that clear, stretchy cervical fluid. So really, it just tells you when is kind of the optimal time to try. So that's kind of what it is, but it doesn't mean pregnancy couldn't happen if you had sex on one of the days when you see that creamy mucus.
Got it. Okay. Now here's a question that I think is people are going to go, I don't even know if I want to know, because we were just ill-informed, not informed as we were doing this. But what about hormonal contraceptives and what do they do to your body? Is this something where I need to I feel like we were all on them at some point, for various reasons, but is this something where we need to worry about long-term effects? So go, but I don't know if I want to hear. No, I'm kidding.
Well, I mean, it's a big question for sure. I think the good news about hormonal contraceptives is that, when you look at the evidence, and there's a lot of it, hormonal contraceptives came out in 1960. So they've been on the market for a really long time. So one of the good things is that we have a ton of research. Like you can really go into rabbit holes. There's tons and tons on it. And so there's not a whole lot of research and evidence that would suggest that the effects of birth control itself are permanent on the body. So there are certain effects we can look at and talk about that may last a little longer than others. But generally speaking, there's not a whole lot of compelling research to show that there's this lasting issue. I think there are other peripheral issues that can crop up that can kind of compound the problem. So what I mean by that is, first of all, we're not really taught a lot about our fertility, about our bodies. And so, I think, like you said, most of us have been on it. I've been on it, right? So a lot of us have been on it. And what I find, and I think one of the things I talk about a lot with clients, and one of the things I try to draw attention to is that when we're in our, let's say, teens and early 20s, we've been bombarded by this idea that we could get pregnant on any day of our cycle. So we're just absolutely terrified. I joke, it's like if you have a male partner and he's in the room, he's looking at you and you're like, no, you need to look the other way. I don't know if that sperm's going to jump. Like, I'm not even comfortable being this far from you, right? So we're just under this impression that pregnancy can happen at any time, and we're like terrified of it. And so from that perspective, we are not being educated about our fertility, how it works, and how it changes over time. So while hormonal birth control may be a great option in some respects, I mean, we can get into some of the pros and cons, right? But while it may be a convenient option or the option of choice at 20, one of the challenges I feel is that as we get a bit older, we're not really being taught about how it could affect fertility. So one of my big concerns about contraceptives isn't that it has permanent effects, but that we know that there's a temporary reduction of fertility when you come off of them. So it doesn't mean that you can't get pregnant as soon as you come off of birth control. But when you look at, again, what the research has to say, so this was something interesting. I was looking at the effects of birth control, and I always find it interesting where you have to look to find this information. So there was this study, and it was looking at fertility preservation. And so fertility preservation is what they call when you actually extract your eggs and freeze them. And so what they found in the study was that if a woman came off of birth control and then got their eggs extracted and frozen immediately, they didn't, when they gave them the trigger shot and all that kind of stuff, there wasn't as many eggs to choose from because the ovarian reserve parameters were lower. So for any of the listeners, if you've ever, had some challenges with fertility and you've ever had to have a consult with a fertility doctor, you'll know that they're going to look at those ovarian reserve parameters. They're going to look at, how many antral follicles. So the antral follicle count, they're going to look at the AMH number, and they're going to look at that ovarian volume. Now, when you're on birth control, those ovarian reserve parameters are lower. The ovarian volume is 50% less. So literally the ovaries shrink. The AMH number is quite low. And then the antral follicle count is less. And the reason for that, the first question you asked me is what is the pill doing to the body? Well, the pill shuts down ovarian production. I mean, that's why it works, because it stops you from ovulating. And so it puts those ovaries into a dormant state. We're often told things like, oh, it makes your body think you're pregnant. So the closest natural equivalent to being on the pill is actually menopause, because in menopause, your ovaries are dormant and then your hormones are really low. Your natural hormones are really low. And so then from that perspective, back to the study, what they found was that for women who wanted the fertility preservation, if they came off the pill 6 to 7 months early, they ended up getting way more eggs and the AMH numbers were better and everything was just flowing a lot better and they had much better results. So the researchers concluded that women who are considering fertility preservation should really consider then coming off the pill a bit sooner to give their body a chance to kind of normalize before they go to extract the eggs. So tell me why we are not given that same suggestion when we're trying to conceive naturally. So although there's no research to say that these effects are permanent and they can take forever, whatever, think about that example. So if you imagine a woman who's waited her whole life, right, for everything to be just right, because that's what we're doing, right? We're waiting for the guy, we're waiting for the job, we're waiting for all the things. So you've been waiting all this time, right, to drop a baby. And so when you come off the pill, you want to get pregnant now. Like, that's how it works. We're emotional. This is how it works. And if nobody tells you that there's this delayed return to fertility situation, you're probably freaking out by month 2, by month 3, when you're not pregnant already. And what I've observed is that we do have this natural transition. For some of us, it takes longer than others. So there are women who come off the pill and, 6 to 12 months later, their cycles normalize. And if they, maybe they start trying later on and maybe they conceive. But for the woman who came off, but she didn't know that, and she's trying immediately, by the time she gets to month 6, she's probably already getting a consult with a fertility doctor. Oh my gosh, her AMH is low and whatever. And no one tells her that it takes time for those numbers to normalize post-pill. And so she's going through all of this stuff when really just no one told her. No one told her about this. So I think you can see what I'm getting at, which is that, knowledge is power. I'm not saying the pill has permanent effects, but we know it has temporary effects. And there's no communication to all the women on the pill that when you're ready to start trying, it would be a good idea to come off a minimum of 6 to 12 months ahead of time. And I would go further to say that if a woman if you're listening and you just took the pill because you were having sex, okay, 6 to 12 months, fine. You never had any issues with your cycle, fine. If you were put on the pill because your cycles were irregular, you never knew when your period was coming, you had like crippling pain and all of that, that puts you in a higher risk category that something's actually wrong because the pill didn't fix that. If you had irregular periods and you're on the pill now, those aren't periods. Those are pill withdrawal bleeds. It's a hormonal thing. It's not a true period. So when you come off, there's no reason to think that you're going to be fixed. Mm-hmm. And you're in a category that would make it more likely. So if a person is in that category, I recommend to seriously consider coming off 18 months to 2 years ahead of time. And so I'm suggesting coming off when you're actually not trying, like when you're still actively voiding, and then coming up with a non-hormonal method to sort that out.
And be obsessed with the why. Yeah. And so I would love to know, what is your preferred method of, and just a quick clarification, just that I wrote down. When we're talking about the birth control, we're talking about, because I know there's many different ones, but the combination birth control pill, which is the estrogen and progesterone birth control pill, right?
Well, so I would say combined estrogen progesterone methods. So because there's the pill, the patch, the different ones, mm-hmm. and they're slightly different, I suppose. I think there is kind of a bit of nuance when we look into the progestin releasing IUDs and things like that. But a lot of the same kind of general information does apply. So that's something to think about as well.
Okay. And so how would you recommend people prevent pregnancy?
I mean, I think that's a bit of a loaded question, right? So I tend not to tell people what to do. I feel like, in many ways.
Okay, I'll refrain. If natural contraception, is it, I'm guessing you teach this in your book and in your method. Is it your natural contraceptive method?
Well, so, I mean, I'll answer the question because I think it's useful to think about it this way. I really think that, the best choice in general is what's going to work best for somebody. So this is how I look at it. I think that we could be looking at birth control differently at different phases of our life. Okay, because I'm not the kind of no one should ever take the pill or everybody should use fertility awareness. That's not my opinion. I just think that we're all different. So if there are women who will never use fertility awareness, they're just that is just too much work. I'm not going to do it. It doesn't appeal to me. You want me to do what with my mucus? Stop it. So there's some women, right, for whom they're just not into it, right? And that's totally fine. It's completely okay. And then there's other women, right, who are really open to it. So I think the first thing is you really got to look at what you're comfortable with, what your sexual preferences are, because everyone's different. Some couples are totally fine with condoms. They love them. And other people hate them. So I feel like there has to be a conversation. We have to look at the nuance here and try to match the best methods with the people because it doesn't matter what I think. If you hate XYZ, then this doesn't help you. I also think we should be looking at what a person might need at different phases of their life. So I've already alluded to that by talking about how the needs of somebody who's in their teens and 20s might be different to the needs of someone who's in their 30s. So I think really and truly, you should be looking at the most important piece of my conversation around contraceptives is knowledge and awareness. I want everyone to know what the most common side effects are of birth control. Did you know that 50% of women come off the pill within the first year because of side effects? They might not come off entirely. They might switch to another pill, but it's half. And that's because the most common side effects are depression and low libido and a variety of different sexual side effects. And there's also the nutrient deficiencies and all these different issues. So there's a lot of women who are actually really unsatisfied with their birth control methods. And they just keep going from, pill to IUD to shot to this and that, whatever, because they keep looking for the one that's going to have the least side effects. So there's some women who have a really negative experience. And those women need to know that there is a non-hormonal method. So of course I teach fertility awareness, and that's learning how to understand what's happening in your cycle. It's not the rhythm method. And the symptothermal method has up to a 99.4% efficacy rate. So it does put it on par with other hormonal options when used correctly. So, we could talk about that. So my whole thing is for women who had a really negative experience of hormonal birth control, I've spoken to so many women who felt trapped. They got to the point where they tried so many different things and they were just like, kind of losing it because they're just like, there's like, what do I do? There's no options. And those women need to know that there is a non-hormonal option. There's other women who don't have such a negative experience on hormonal birth control. And I think for those women, that's a different conversation. If they really just don't have a negative experience with it, I still think they should be informed about the side effects. And I do think that we should be having that conversation about, when you should be transitioning off hormonal contraceptives, especially if you're planning to have a baby. Because I feel strongly that we should be armed with that information. You should be able to have a baby if you want to. And so you should be aware of the fact that, when you hit those ages, when you're, having a baby conversation is a year out or 2 years out or 3 years out, we should be thinking about coming off of those hormones, giving our body a chance to rest, getting through that post-pill transition phase so that our ovaries are back to normal, our hormones are back to normal, our AMH levels are normal, all those things before we're even ready to start trying. That would be optimal in my perspective. So did I answer the question?
Yes. Yes. I love
Okay,
that.
good.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. And so I know we need to wrap it up in a little bit, but can you just share a couple practical strategies to improve your menstrual cycle?
Yes, absolutely. I think what I always talk about with my clients are the foundational factors, because I think everyone's always looking for magical supplements. And of course, I can talk about a few supplements that are, great for supporting hormones. But really and truly, you're going to get the best results by a combined approach. So really looking at your lifestyle factors in addition to the kind of supplement approach. So the most basic things like that cause people's eyes to like roll back in their heads would be to start with, getting really good sleep. What's really interesting is sleeping in the dark, like getting good sleep. So, 7 hours kind of on average a night, but also sleeping in the dark can be really beneficial to your hormones. There's studies that show that literally just by putting blackout blinds on, in your windows and really making sure that your room is dark, it can extend your luteal phase. It can boost your progesterone because it really supports that melatonin production at nighttime, things like that. So, good quality sleep. I know we all hear about it, but how many of your listeners and viewers actually have a totally dark room and are really, good there? So that's something basic. The food conversation is huge. And so this is something that in the new book that we have coming out, Real Food for Fertility, we're really jumping into that. So my co-author and I are really sharing the step-by-step approach for how to eat to optimize your fertility. And interestingly, it really starts with getting enough food and making sure you have a good balance of macronutrients, making sure you have sufficient protein for your activity level. One of the things I think that is so common that I see the most are women who are super active, but really under eating on that protein. And that affects everything. And it really impairs your ability to have proper hormone balance. For anyone who starts tracking their cycle, what's really interesting about cycle tracking is that as you track, you track your period, you track your cervical fluid, like we talked about, you track your ovulation, and then we track that luteal phase. And again, that's the period of time between ovulation and your next period. And it should be about 12 to 14 days. And what's so interesting is that luteal phase gives us so much information about what's happening with your progesterone. So if it's too short, if you have spotting before your period, if you have raging PMS, all of those things fall into that category of low progesterone. And it literally starts by getting enough protein and making sure that you are really balancing those macros and just to make sure that you're getting enough for your activity level. And I stress that because it's that important. It's huge. And one of the things I had mentioned with my own story was that, when my teacher was looking at my charts, like my charting instructor, and she noticed that my temperatures were low. And in my case, I did have an issue with my thyroid. And so it's really common for women to think, oh my gosh, I have low temperatures. I must have a problem with my thyroid. And the most common reason for low temperatures on the menstrual cycle chart is undereating. So that's something to consider. So, once you have some of those basic things taken care of, I mean, certainly I would say it really depends on what's going on in your cycle. But, supporting progesterone is a question I get a lot. So in addition to eating enough, I know magnesium is a really helpful addition, I think, for a lot of women for a lot of different reasons. I've had so many clients add magnesium into their overall, supplement profile and see improvements in their sleep, see reductions in their PMS symptoms, even reductions in their period pain. So I think there's a lot, it's a whole rabbit hole, but I think to answer your question, those are the first three things that came to mind.
Okay. I love it. All right. And so tell us a little bit about your book and your book that's coming out and, what is kind of the one takeaway you would love for readers to get from your book?
Well, so, today we were talking all about the parameters of the menstrual cycle and cervical mucus and all those things. And so in my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign, that's where I really dive into those details detail into the weeds. In our new book, and I'm saying our because this was a joint effort, my co-author, Lily Nichols, is a registered dietitian. And so we teamed up to really give the whole story about how to support optimal fertility. And so within this book, within the first several chapters, you're really thrown into optimal nutrition for fertility, which is just, and what's great about the book is that it's not just a take our word for it scenario. We had so many citations in this book that we had to put them in a separate PDF download because they would have added like 100 extra pages to the book. So not only do you get the what, you get the how, but also the why, because we're showing you that this is what the research says is optimal for balancing hormones. And then once we get past those first few chapters, then we really get into the fertility information. So in Real Food for Fertility, we do not as deep of a dive, but we do jump into menstrual cycle, fertility awareness, charting. We have some really meaty chapters on optimizing egg and sperm quality. We go in deep about PCOS and HA. It's a really well-rounded book to support you no matter where you are on your fertility awareness journey and fertility journey also.
Yeah, I've had her talk to my group many years ago, and I used to give my clients her Real Food for Pregnancy. That's why when you're like, Real Food for Fertility, does she know that there's a Real Food for Pregnancy out there by Lily Nichols?
Oh,
but
exactly.
Yes, you do.
Yes. And so it's like her book and my book had a baby.
Yeah. I love it. And I remember reading her book. I have it right over there. So many citations for research. Yeah, she's very well researched. And yeah, she was a guest speaker at one of our group calls. Oh, well, this is so wonderful. Thank you so much for all that you've taught us. And I've taken so many good notes, and I can't wait to read your book, Real Food for Fertility with Lily Nichols. I love her and I love you. So thank you so much, Lisa, for joining us. This is what is going to help women all around the world just get obsessed with the why, understand and be so well educated on what their menstrual cycle, what their health and wellness should really look like. So I thank you for what you do and your mission and helping all these mamas around the world so much easier, get pregnant so much easier. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And just to mention the book, you'll find the information at realfoodforfertility.com. You'll be able to get the first chapter for free, so a sneak peek. And so thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun and you asked so many great questions. So thank you so much again.
Of course. And just really quickly to find you, I know it's at Fertility Friday, right? Yes. On Instagram at Fertile Friday, on Twitter, Pinterest, Fertility Friday, Skype, Fertility Friday, Facebook, Fertility Friday. So
yeah, my main place I hang out is Instagram. I mean, I feel like that's where a lot of the party happens. And then we've also got the other pages there. So at Fertility Friday for sure. And for anyone who is really, this conversation was really interesting to you and your mind is blown and you're wanting to take a deeper dive into this whole fertility awareness conversation, that you could search Fertility Friday on your favorite podcast player and you'll find the Fertility Friday podcast. By this time that this episode was released, we're like well over episode 500. So it's nuts. Lots of info for you.
I love it. And I'll also put your mentorship that you have, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship. I'll put a link to that as well. So if somebody wants to learn from you and join your mentorship, they'll have access to that as well.
Well, thank you so much for that. Yes, the mentorship is where I have focused on training practitioners. There's such a need for this information to get out there. And although I would love to do it one woman at a time, I have transitioned into teaching practitioners essentially the FAM method of chart interpretation, as well as supporting women to balance their hormones. So there's a whole system that we teach our practitioners. And so thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share about it.
Of course. Right. Thank you, Lisa.